The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass. If you would like this program to continue, please be ready to pledge financial support when you are asked later in the program.
As if there has not been enough killing already, namely 28 million babies since Roe v. Wade of 1973, there is currently a bill before the Senate and the House called the Freedom of Choice Act, which would completely make abortion on demand unrestricted. No restrictions whatsoever. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. You know, we have a very strange period of history. People, when they consider that baby seals are being slaughtered, will literally shed tears of compassion. But when they see what we're going to show you now, and again, those who are of a more sensitive nature, I'd like to warn you, this is the picture of an aborted baby who suffered a horrible, horrible death. When one would say this should not be allowed, the reaction of the seal lovers would be one of tremendous violence. With me today to discuss the Freedom of Choice Act are Dan Laporte, an Akron, Ohio attorney and prominent worker in the Right to Life movement, and Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio, and publisher and editor of The Roman Catholic. Dan, maybe you could tell us something about this Freedom of Choice Act, which is now being considered by Congress, and which I understand President Clinton has given every indication that he would sign.
Julius, the Freedom of Choice Act is presently in two versions. The first version is in the House of Representatives. It's House Bill 25. It is the version of the bill that was overruled by President Bush during 1992. In general, it attempts to restore the original rule of Roe v. Wade, which is abortion on demand, during all 3 trimesters. Essentially, that's the rule of Roe v. Wade coupled with Doe v. Bolton, because even in the 3rd trimester, although the health of the mother is an exception, that exception is any type of health of the mother, psychologically or whatever. Now, the reason for the Freedom of Choice Act was simply that in the past few years since the Webster decision in 1989 and the Casey decision in 1992, both U.S. Supreme Court decisions, started to restrict the right to freedom of choice during all 3 trimesters. And states now are allowed, prior to the passage of this Freedom of Choice Act, to restrict the right to abortion in certain areas, as so long as it doesn't impose an undue burden on what the Supreme Court in the Casey decision called a woman's fundamental right to decide whether to carry the child to term or not. Casey was really, although it supported almost all of the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act, really hurt the pro-life movement because it shifted from the basis of the right to privacy to a liberty interest under the 14th Amendment. That liberty interest can be enforced by congressional legislation. And it's interesting, in the Senate version of the Freedom of Choice Act, and both of these versions ultimately will be decided upon by a joint congressional committee, the Senate version expressly refers to the power of the Congress to enforce constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment. Now, the privacy right was really the basis for Roe v. Wade, and yet it was bypassed by the Casey decision because no one could figure out what that privacy right was ultimately, and was very much criticized. But Casey placed it as a liberty interest, so that this bill will not allow states to restrict the right to abortion as they presently can do under the Casey decision.
My understanding, maybe you could review some of the key provisions of this bill, is that under FOCA, a hospital that refuses to perform abortions could be sued.
Well, it comes more from the, you're correct, but it's really a question of funding. Under the House version of FOCA, a state could not be prevented from passing a law which, in effect, funded abortion with state monies, and your tax money and my tax money. Under the Senate version, there is an exception that will not prevent a state from having an exception to the law for people with conscientious objection to assisting at abortions, or to a law which would allow the state not to fund abortions. We believe that it will only be in that last version that ultimately will pass out of conference, because this Senate version, I believe, has a better chance of passage than the really hardline version in the House, but we don't know. And of course, people should endeavor to write their congressman in all regards to this thing.
Father Jenkins, to me it's kind of strange. Don't we have enough abortion? I mean, why do they need this piece of legislation on top of the Roe v. Wade decision, which produced 28 million deaths?
Well, how much abortion is enough abortion? One abortion is too much. It's the wanton destruction of an innocent life, which is murder by definition. But I think the feminists are so determined to overcome any resistance to the recognition of a strict right to abortion under any and all circumstances, because they look upon any restraint as a threat to them. I think it might even affect their consciences. I don't know how well those are still working, but regardless, I think they see any resistance to what they perceive as their right to destroy this thing that is a problem for them as a threat to them. And I think they're not going to rest until they batter down every single bit of restraint, legal restraint, no matter where it is. And you know, they're not only going to do this by means of legislation, but they're going to you know, undertake every form of harassment they can against those who want legal restraints maintained, and that's what they've been doing to the pro-life movement now for years.
Dan, surprisingly enough, there's a number of, let's just say many people, who are convinced that when they have an abortion and the baby's still not born, that what they have inside them is simply a tumor or a mass of flesh. And I can remember speaking with more than one nurse who said that the mother-to-be who aborted the child said after the completion of the procedure, "I can't believe that actually looked like a baby." I think even in our enlightened age, very many people don't know what the baby goes through in abortion. Maybe you could fill in some of the gaps for us.
Well, and I might advise the viewers that it's a very unpleasant matter to explain. But in a second or third trimester abortion especially, the abortionist generally will use his instruments to go inside the vagina and the womb and actually dismember the child piece by piece, take the pieces out with his forceps, reassemble them at a table beside him to make sure that he has all of the pieces out, and then proceed to complete the abortion. In Akron, we had a case where an abortionist attempted to perform a very late third trimester abortion. Now, generally, they'll stay away from very late third trimester abortions unless they specialize in that, because they simply can't get malpractice coverage. But this was done after hours. And we got this directly from a nurse who was involved in it and who quit because of it. The baby was so large that the arms and legs and members of his torso and head had to be put not in one bucket, which they generally do, and then they sell these to laboratories on the sly, because it's a misdemeanor in Ohio to do it now, but it had to be put in two buckets. And that was too much for this nurse, and she balked at that and was hesitant, and she was fired on the spot. So this is what happens. Another type of abortion is called a saline abortion, where a salt solution is injected in and in effect burns the child to death within the womb, and then it's evacuated. That's done when it isn't that large. So these are very barbarous customs.
And I imagine there's tremendous pain that's associated even for the baby if he's a little older.
Well, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
And something you said puzzles me a little bit. You say that the nurse reacted because they had to use 2 buckets for the parts of this baby's body. But she had assisted in abortions in which the baby's body could be reassembled in 1 bucket.
Yes.
And that didn't affect her.
Apparently not.
Peculiar.
Apparently not. I think it's a matter, it just typifies what our society is going through. We are so used to this that this doesn't bother us to hear that there are 4,000 abortions every day, and it evidently didn't bother this nurse that she had to assist at abortions where it could be handled in an assembly line fashion. But one other fact which is very grotesque in this after-hours abortion was that in order for the doctor to get in with his instruments, the baby was so large, she had to actually sit almost on the woman's stomach to effect this.
Oh.
So there were a couple other facts there that may have been more repugnant to her than usual.
Is she pro-life now? Or?
We don't know.
Was this just,
she came to us and then she kind of vanished, and we've tried to locate her because we've had litigation on behalf of various rescues at that, and we thought that would certainly help to sway a jury, but we've never been able to locate her.
Is that right? So if she's watching right now, she might want to contact you. And
yes,
maybe do something to offset all of the cooperation she's
We'd certainly
given.
appreciate it.
My understanding is that there were quite a few Catholic, so-called Catholic sponsors of the Freedom of Choice Act.
That's true. I might read some from House Bill 25 after an introduction by Mr. Edwards of California, Mr. Fazio, Mrs. Keneally, Mrs. Morella, Mrs. Molinari, Mr. Sabo, to mention a few, all, I don't know whether they're Catholic or not, but certainly Catholic names, a Catholic background. And of course, one of the sponsors of the Senate version is Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts, and also Senator Kerry from Massachusetts.
And again, this whole question, again, the Novus Ordo bishops, I believe, are opposing FOCA, but then they undo, or rather nullify, their opposition by doing nothing, by not reprimanding these so-called Catholic politicians.
It's always too little, too late. Very recently, they printed 15 million cards to send to Senate and House representatives and distributed them at Mass. And I understand that people couldn't understand how President Clinton could sponsor this type of legislation because, of course, they had just voted for President Clinton and put him in the White House. So after the fact, after Clinton's in the White House, then they spend all of this money to try to defeat this act. This act is probably going to pass.
The modern bishops seem to be living in dread of public opinion. Public opinion seems to be the catechism for them right now. And it's too bad. It's too bad that, you know, instead of taking the moral high ground when this whole problem erupted back in 72 and 73, those who are pushing for abortion on demand would decry the Catholic influence and make it look as though this was a Catholic, despotic Catholic effort to deny women abortion rights. Well, what could have been a greater glory for the Catholic Church than to say, yes, this is a Catholic effort. We are going to resist the murder of unborn children with every fiber in our beings. And we're going to pay whatever price is necessary in order to do this, because this is a matter of moral principle. Instead of saying that, what they did was they ducked, they went undercover, they tried to be very, very inobtrusive about this, and they left the field clear for the radicals to take over. And now it happens some fundamentalist ministers come forward and look as though they're assuming the leadership of this effort, where it really does pertain to the Catholic bishops, who are real Catholic bishops, to be like the moral conscience of the nation and to take the leadership. It just makes you wonder how these men got into the positions they did, who placed them there, when we see how they crack under the slightest pressure
of public opinion and that cannot stand up for what is right. You know, even the ones who are standing up and being a little more public about their opposition to abortion have been promoting legislation which admits of exceptions. It says that, yes, you know, some of the babies can be killed. Obviously, with the idea that we're going to sneak a piece of legislation through, we're going to compromise on the issue, and you know they'll accept this if we let them know that if they pass this legislation, we'll be somewhat pleased by it, and maybe call off the dogs a little bit. Then they'll go ahead and give us the lives of some of the children if we give them the lives of the others to destroy. We obviously have to pray for these people assiduously, that God will somehow pierce this barrier they set up and just come forward to be very strong on the matter of principle.
You're watching what Catholics believe.
Dan, I wonder if I might ask you a question. What is the earliest that FOCA might pass the House or the Senate, assuming it does pass?
I think you could see something by June.
Really?
I really do. I think this will be something that will be pushed by the Democratic leadership in both the House and Senate because the administration is floundering now in their appointments. One of the first things that the president did when after he was inaugurated was to sign the various executive orders restoring all right to use the fetus in experimentation for research purposes and to allow abortions and abortion directions to be given in federal and Army clinics. So it shows his frame of mind. Of course, we can no longer rely upon a president that will veto this bill. So the greatest hope we have is some sort of bill that will contain enough exceptions to allow legislation like the Abortion Control Act in Pennsylvania to remain on the books and enforceable. But I would expect an early passage of this in some form.
Is that right? This will essentially turn the tables, I gather, if I understand correctly, whereas now what many of the pro-life leaders have proposed are the so-called imperfect legislation of laws that admit exceptions for abortion. The best we could hope for from this is that they would pass this, if they do, and allow certain exceptions for states to forbid abortions.
Yes.
So we're on the exception side.
Yeah, we're on certainly the losing side of the proposition with this bill.
I'd like to ask you a question about this experimentation with fetuses, which President Clinton signed into effect by the means of an executive order. You know, I recall reading when the so-called former communist regimes are now making public confessions of their crimes against, you know, humanity. Say in East Germany, a person would go into a hospital and he had 2 very good kidneys. He left the hospital, he had 1 kidney. While he was under anesthesia, they would take a kidney from him and give it to a Communist Party official. With this fetal experimentation, I'm wondering how close we're coming to a mentality that will produce that. I understand that they might want to preserve some of the organs, and in order to preserve them, the baby must still be alive before they dismember it.
I think that's vital to any form of fetal experimentation. The child must be aborted before it's dismembered, before its brain is used, before portions of its brain are sucked out and so forth to use for the various forms of experimentation. So yes, the baby does have to be alive in the womb.
You know,
this is actually worse than cannibalism. You know, they talk about the civilized society in which we live, but actually we're breeding a nation of cannibals, or worse. You know, the idea of a person from one tribe killing and eating a person from another tribe is one thing, but for a mother to destroy her own child and then knowing that that child's body is going to be taken alive, artificially maintained alive, so that the scientists can run experiments on her child. Can you imagine if this had happened in Nazi Germany, if mothers volunteered their children to undergo the knife of Dr. Mengele? And those mothers would be they would be put on trial before the world for doing something like this, but now the world upholds them. You know, you warned people about the picture you're going to show about the aborted child's head being held in the forceps and how gruesome that is. Well, I've heard pro-choicers, so-called. Actually, what they are is simply they're in favor of murdering children.
Pro-death.
That's what they are. I've heard them complain about those posters. They say they're gruesome and we don't want them on. The gentleman Bailey in southern Indiana, who ran campaign ads showing aborted children, drew an awful lot of fire from the pro-abortionists, you know, that he was putting these graphic depictions of dismembered bodies on the air. Well, you know what this reminds me of? This is as though Jeffrey Dahmer would complain to the prosecution because they were showing pictures of his dismembered victims, and he found it gruesome and disgusting. These are the people who are doing this. If they can't even stand to look at it, why can't it seep into their consciences that they shouldn't consent to doing it? They shouldn't vote for someone who does. They should somehow protest. They should vote their conscience is what they should do.
It's so unnecessary, too, because when this issue came up in 1992 and the original version of the act was vetoed by President Bush, by executive order, set aside about $5 million to set up a bank for aborted fetuses from natural abortions, not induced abortions, and from tubal pregnancies. And that would, according to the National Institute of Health, would have afforded as much fetal experimentation as anybody would desire. So it is not necessary to do what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Father Jenkins, I get the sense that certain fundamentalist fire and brimstone preachers would say that, you know, this country is going to be destroyed and punished because of this, and the pro-choice enlightened lobby looks at them and says, well, we're still here, we're not destroyed. You know, as if we didn't have enough abortion, they're going to have even more abortion. What is in store for us from the point of view of divine retribution for permitting something like this, and not only permitting it, but asserting it, that this is a right, and promoting it aggressively?
Well, Julius, you've heard the saying, virtue is its own reward, and I think vice is going to be its own punishment. I think God is going to let us stew in our own juices. I think the abortion mentality is going to take over more and more, and is going to affect more and more segments of our population. I think the abandonment of the servicemen over in Vietnam at the conclusion of the Vietnam War was a symptom of the whole mentality of human life being negotiable. I really do think that the abortion holocaust in this country and the abandonment of our missing in actions are two related events. And I think that's going to take over more and more, and we're going to see more and more the idea that human life is cheap, very cheap. And anybody who is inconvenient and gets in the way of a stronger, more powerful individual is going to have to fear for his life. But, Dan, I have a question for you, too. You're an attorney, and many of those who go into public life, into political life, are attorneys. How can people do something like this? How can Catholic attorneys go into political life and then support something like this?
Well, I think many of these attorneys and many of these politicians will point to their oaths that they take at the time they become members of the bar, or at the time they are sworn into judicial offices or legislative offices. And to them, the fulfillment of that oath is the most important thing in their life. It's akin to they're looking at that oath the way an SS officer would look at his blood oath to the Fuhrer in the 1930s. In other words, they have been so secularized that the moral order is completely gone, and it's the good of this so-called democratic society that they look to, and that they are going to uphold at all costs, moral or otherwise. That's the only way I can understand what they're doing.
Do you think they have any fear that, well, I mean, I gather from what you say that they don't really have any awareness that they're doing this, that it's all very, it's become second nature to them?
They express it as they're doing their duty. They've taken an oath. I heard it in a court the other day, in a case involving a young girls being starved to death. The judge stating from the bench, I don't know what faith he practices, he says, I've taken an oath to uphold the law, and yet his decision was to starve that 14-year-old girl to death. So they look upon what they're doing as something virtuous, and it's very hard to deal with, very hard. And
Are they afraid of the pro-lifers at all? I mean, sometimes you hear pro-life people saying, this is murder, and if we get the chance, we're going to arraign you on murder charges sooner or later. Do you think that concerns them? Do you think that motivates them all the more bitterly to attack the pro-life cause and to push abortion through to its logical conclusion?
I don't know how much of their motivation comes from a personal animus to pro-life attorneys or the pro-life movement. I tend to think it's more of what we were talking about formerly, is they are so much a part of this secular society. They have risen in it to the heights of their profession. They look upon it as satisfying all of their needs, and anything else that reminds them of what they might have learned as young men or young women, they just want to put out of their mind. And they want to put anybody in their profession out of their mind completely who takes these views and defends the pro-life movement in any way.
You've been watching What Catholics Believe. We've